After getting let go at my office job, I was in a bind to find another means to pay the bills. Unfortunately, not a lot of places were hiring in my area, and the places that were accepting applications were giving out paltry wages that would just barely cover my living expenses. As the days increased, my search was becoming increasingly limited until I came across a posting in search of a security guard. It was for a nationally based security company, and they hire people based on the needs of the area. When there is an influx of security requests, it typically opens up for new applications. To be honest, I wasn't sold on the idea, but the pay was a bit more substantial than the other places hiring. The only drawback I could find were the requirements. It was my understanding that I would be assigned to various locations during my time there. One day I might sit outside a strip mall, and another I may be walking around a junkyard. I pondered the decision for a few moments before typing up and sending off my application. A week went by without any word, and my job hunt continued. I was certain there were multiple people far better qualified for doing the job, so I tried not to feel too bad about getting overlooked. Then, at the end of the week, I received an email letting me know that I was slated for an interview the upcoming Monday. Monday morning arrived. I put on a clean suit and showed up bright and early for the interview. The senior supervisor was a large man sitting behind a desk with multiple stacks of paper on it. He had a very serious demeanor as he looked through my application. He asked me a few passing questions and continued to look through the paperwork. I had no idea if the interview was going well or poorly. I just sat there patiently waiting. After a couple more minutes, he looked up from the paperwork and smiled at me. He asked when I would be available to start, and I told him immediately. He nodded and explained that I would be trained over the course of a month. Then I'd be dispatched out to various locations for a set amount of time. I thanked him, shook his hand, and I left. That feeling of relief returned as I hopped into my car and headed home. Now, I've been working for this security company for nearly 2.5 years by this point. During my time with this job, I've encountered some pretty odd things and guarded even stranger locations. One of the weird locations that come to mind was this abandoned mall that was slated to be demoed towards the end of the year. While I could talk about that whole unnerving situation by itself, the reason I'm writing this is due to a job that occurred about a week ago. I had received a call from my supervisor, informing me that I had just gotten assigned to a new location. I asked what sort of job this was, and he said it was just a small warehouse. Apparently, the company that owns it had concerns about theft occurring after hours. My boss told me that we were pretty short on manpower, so unless I specifically requested some assistance, I'd be flying solo for the most part. To be honest, I didn't mind being alone for a few nights. The job began on a Tuesday. It took me a bit longer than expected to navigate the back alley streets to the location even with GPS. After nearly an hour of driving, I pulled into a small backlot and hopped out of the truck. I stood outside the looming warehouse and muttered "small" underneath my breath. I took out the keys that I had picked up beforehand and entered the rear door. I noticed the security system on my right beginning to beep, and I quickly disarmed it. I flicked the light switch and turned. When I did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a face directly in front of me. I took a few steps back, almost falling back out of the door. Catching my breath, I realized what type of warehouse this was. It was a mannequin storage space. There were hundreds of mannequins in all shapes and designs standing around the building, their formless faces all desperately trying to grab the attention of any would-be shopper. I zipped up my jacket and rubbed my eyes and began getting a lay of the land. There were a few offices towards the back, and various workbenches set up throughout the space. Multiple crates lined the walls, but apart from the mannequins themselves, everything appeared to be normal. I spent the first evening just hanging around inside my truck. I periodically checked the back door, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. At roughly 2:30 in the morning, I was catching up on some Netflix on my phone when I heard a sound coming from outside. My attention was instantly pulled to the door of the warehouse. The sound was unmistakable to a door shutting. I turned off my phone, got out, and walked over to the door. I pulled the door open and peeked inside with my flashlight. Nothing immediately stood out. I called out to the interior asking if anyone was in here. Not a single sound filled the silence. I checked my watch and returned back to my truck. I only had a few hours left before I could head home. I angled my truck to face the door and made a point to keep a better eye on it until the end of my shift. I saw nothing unusual. And at the end of my shift, when I went to lock up, I thought one of the mannequins had moved slightly, but quickly buried the thought before heading home. The next 2 days on the job went about as normal as you would expect. No noises, no sign of entry or exit, just a lot of time sitting around doing nothing. Then, on the 3rd, I showed up to the warehouse a bit later than usual due to waking up late. The time was nearing 10:30 p.m., a good hour and a half past when I was supposed to be there. I'd been late a handful of times over the 2 years working for this company, and usually it isn't a big deal. I parked and went to check the interior, and that's when I noticed something strange. As I put the key into the door, I didn't feel any resistance. I twisted the knob and the door popped open. Whoever works here must have forgotten to lock up after their shift. I stepped inside to disable the alarm and nearly fell on my ass as I saw a mannequin standing immediately to my right. It was arranged in a walking pose, with its right arm reaching out towards me. I quickly regained my composure and I picked it up and moved it a few feet away so I could reach the system. Upon disabling it, I walked around and inspected the area. Again, nothing caught my attention. I resumed my routine of sitting outside and keeping watch until my shift was over. When I went back inside to set the alarm again, I gave one more glance around and everything was fine. Until my light cascaded over the mannequin that I had moved at the start of my shift. It was standing straight up, with its arms at its sides, and its head was now tilted towards the door. I pretended not to notice. I set the alarm and quickly stepped outside, locking the door behind me. I lightly jogged back to my truck and once inside began to question what I saw. That mannequin was definitely in a different position at the beginning of the night, and I hadn't adjusted it aside from moving it a few feet. I drove home and drank a nice tall glass of whiskey before drifting off to bed. The last day made me question whether or not to continue being a security guard. I showed up on time and went inside to check things out. There were more mannequins than the first day, and I just assumed that they had gotten another storage shipment in. After my once over, I returned to my truck and began to watch a TV show on my phone. About 45 minutes into the series, I glanced up and saw something that sent goosebumps down my arm. The door to the warehouse was completely open. Just a dark void stared at me as I looked around for any trespassers. I got out and walked over to it. I stepped inside with my flashlight and called out asking if anyone was in here. I waited for a moment. And just when I was about to close the door and head back to the truck, the sound of something clattering in the back rang out. I felt myself jump in my skin. Something had to have caused that noise, I thought. I called out once more, summoning every ounce of courage in me to step inside. I turned the light switch on and looked around. Everything seemed fine, aside from the mannequins. I walked to the back where I heard the noise, and found a small paint can resting on its side. Only there was nothing in the immediate vicinity. Not even any mannequins. I turned to head back to the door, and I watched as a mannequin stepped into my vision and pulled the door shut, while another reached out and flicked the light switch. I shouted, dropping my flashlight in the process. I could hear the clattering of plastic and metal hitting the ground as I stood there frozen in the dark. Regaining my senses, I quickly knelt down and searched for my flashlight. My hand rested on what I assumed to be the flashlight, but it felt different. It was in the shape of a plastic foot. I recoiled back onto my side and felt my flashlight next to me. I picked it up, pointing it in front of me. There were 4 mannequins all standing around me. Their heads were twitching to the left and right rapidly, like they were trying to listen for sounds without ears. One of them reached out for me and I scrambled backwards. When I did, I bumped into something solid. I turned, flashlight in hand, and saw a fifth mannequin looming over me. My body seized, unable to react, and in that moment of hesitation, I felt a sharp impact on the nape of my neck. My vision went white, followed by a swift darkness. Sometime later, I awoke. My head was splitting, but as I regained focus, I realized I was now sitting in my truck. I glanced around rapidly, wondering how I had gotten back in here. I began to wonder if I had possibly fallen asleep in my truck, and that the whole ordeal was just some bizarre nightmare. The next morning, I received a call from my boss saying that the warehouse owner said that I had left the door unlocked the previous night. I apologized to him for the error, and he brushed it off, saying it wasn't that much of a big deal. I told him that I wanted to use up some of my vacation time and unwind for a while. He understood and said that'd be fine. Just before we got off the phone, however, I suggested not taking any more jobs from that location going forward. He attempted to ask why, but all I could manage to say was, the mannequins don't seem to like security guards. He took it as a joke and chuckled before telling me to enjoy my vacation. I'm not exactly sure what happened, if it was all in my imagination or not, but I think I'm going to pass on guarding warehouses, at least for a while.